Hello everyone and welcome to the fourth event in our series of Unboxing Open Scholarship Talks here in Trinity College. Before we get started, in cases of emergency, please note the nearest fire exit to you. There's one down here, there's one here, and there's one at the door there. The event is being streamed. We are recording the event and there will be photography as well, so if you don't want to be in any images, please notify us after the event. Also, for the Q&A section, can you please make sure to speak into the microphone and also to wait until you have the microphone to make your points. We're fortunate to be joined today by Professor Mike Eisen, who, as all of you are aware, is a powerhouse in open science, or as we call it here in Trinity College, open scholarship. It's wonderful to have such a large crowd here, and it shows how important this subject is to our community. Last night I was at the new Avengers movie and no spoilers, but I came away from it thinking that we're in an end game in ourselves as well. We have Plan S and we have the European Commission with policies coming into play in January 2020. So, you know, there's only a few months to go and it's important that we're having these conversations with that in mind. I think I took away from it a line, whatever it takes. You've probably seen it, anyone who's looked at the trailers, and certainly Mike has lived that out through his own work, so think of that now today as well. And speaking of movies as well, next week we have a paywall screening, The Business of Scholarship, that's going to take place as part of Trinity Week. It's on Wednesday at 12 o'clock. We'd love it if you could all attend that as well. But enough about movies for now. Today's session will begin with the presentation by Mike. It will be followed by him in conversation with our wonderful college librarian, Helen Shenton. And following this, there'll be plenty of time for question and answers from the floor. And of course, this is followed by a lunch in the Essentia Lounge outside. But now let me introduce you to the wonderful college librarian and archivist, Helen Shenton. Helen is the co-chair of the Trinity Open Scholarship Taskforce and has a strong track record of leadership and management in world-class organizations. Helen was previously the executive director of Harvard Library, where she co-led the transition to a new governance, funding and organizational model there. And with 73 individual libraries making up Harvard's 383-year-old history, almost as old as Trinity, give or take half a century, she managed multiple stakeholders, and her work was most renowned on the research libraries in terms of digitization, accessibility, collection and content development, and of course records management. And since moving to Trinity, she has been dedicated to making our collections here as accessible to the public as policy, and has participated in a number of open scholarship related events over the years. So please give a warm welcome to Helen Shenton.
Thank you so much, Shane. I've never been called wonderful before. And let me introduce you to the Associate Dean of Research, Lorraine Leeson, who is also very much part of the the Task Force on Open Scholarship, and who is obviously, this is her expertise. And what we're thinking is that we should always do sign language at our lectures. Okay. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Mike Eisen. He's currently Professor of Genetics and Genomics at University of California, trained at Harvard. We had breakfast this morning. We were shooting the breeze about Red Sox. and then Stanford and so on. But I think what he is most known for is this making a stand around open access and living it by declaring his lab to be all open access, and by founding PLOS, the Public Library of Science, and then PLOS One, which is actually the most. It's now the largest scientific journal in the world.
It may have been surpassed.
Oh, okay. Then
it was at one time.
It was at one time. It has been one of the most largest scientific journals in the world. So Mike is going to talk to us about how this came about and so on. Intriguingly, he also stood for Senate a couple of years ago. When we have our question and answer, our conversation, I think I'll particularly ask about the implications of that. But I'd like you to give a very, very warm welcome to Professor Mike Eisen.
All right. Thank you guys very much for inviting me, Helen and Jane and Mani and others for hosting a wonderful, if somewhat short visit. I'm going to tell you kind of my own personal story a little bit and a little bit about just how I think about open scholarship, and in particular about how I think we've kind of missed a bunch of opportunities along the way towards making science more accessible. And why I think we're at an end game, as Shane says, moment. Hopefully it does not involve killing 50% of the people in the world, although perhaps killing 50% of the journals would be our equivalent. Sorry for making Avengers jokes for those who haven't seen it. So the internet was developed several decades ago. Ostensibly, as one of your colleagues pointed out, it was developed by the military under the pretense of helping scientists to communicate with each other. But the early vestiges of the internet existed at national labs and universities, and its use for most of its early years was kind of a niche thing that let scientists sort of send email, play Pong with each other, and things like that. And as we know now, the internet has transformed life in almost all of its manifestations. For me, as a big sports fan, it's still the most amazing thing that I can sit in my hotel room in Dublin and watch a baseball game on my telephone thousands of miles away. I tried to give you a local manifestation of this. Pick some. What the internet tells me is Ireland's greatest soccer moment. There you go. All right. It's better than our most amazing soccer moments in the US. But of all the things that the internet has transformed, the one thing really that it is most noticeably not transformed is how scientists communicate with each other. And this is kind of the theme of my talk, that science communication is stuck in the previous century. This is papers from the 21st century and the 20th century. They look basically identical to each other. In fact, you can make a pretty compelling case that science communication is stuck in the 17th century, back when it was originally invented. This is a page from the Proceedings of the Royal Society in its first edition. You could read these. Actually, it's easier to read the articles in a 17th century journal than in a 21st century journal. And I like to imagine Francis Bacon. I saw a nice statue of him upstairs in the library earlier. If Francis Bacon came to the world today, and Francis Bacon was in the Royal Society at its beginning and was involved in the launching of its journal. If he came to the world today, absolutely everything he would find alienating, amazing, and scary. But he would take comfort in looking in the pages of a scientific journal because that is something that he would find familiar. The form is the same, the language is much the same, and that should horrify and embarrass all of us that is true. And so I like to point out that as far as communication among scientists go, we've completely failed the opportunity that the internet presented us to make what we do better in essentially every way. I want to just highlight, from my view, what the main pathologies of science communication are. So first of all, and this has been the focus of much of my life for the last 20 years, is it's restricted. The internet has the potential to give access to everybody with an internet connection or a phone or anything, access to all of humanity's knowledge. And yet, despite that potential, maybe 1 in 10,000 people on the planet has any kind of meaningful access to the scientific literature and the scholarly literature, which you can make a good case as humanity's greatest and most enduring creation. The vast majority of researchers, let alone teachers and students and doctors and healthcare professionals, just don't have access to the scientific and scholarly literature, and that's just insane, right? But that's not the only problem. The literature is incredibly static. As I pointed out, scientific journals began to be published in print form 350 years ago, and they've evolved very little in that time. And in fact, almost all the way in which we structure scientific papers and we share information in papers is predicated on the idea that they're printed, that they're stuck in this linear, static form. And really, the only real changes that have happened in the 350 years has been the introduction of color figures, right? Hardly a great use of information technology. It's incredibly slow, right? The internet is fast. I can take a video of my cat, or I don't have a cat, but if I did, I could take a video of my cat and post it online, and immediately someone in Botswana could be watching it with no restrictions. But if I have a work of science and I want to share it with the world, the standard system we have for sharing it delays its communication to the planet by insane amounts of time. In fact, the typical paper in science takes about 9 months from when the author finishes their first, the version that they feel ready to share with the world, and they submit it to a journal and so forth. It takes 9 months for that to be shared. And that delay impairs not just the progress of science, but the application of science to the public and by years. And you can make a good argument that these delays kill tens of millions of people every year and so forth. Okay, I put this up here because another thing that takes about 9 months is the process of sending a rocket to Mars from Earth and then having it land on the surface. And indeed, if you had the choice between, and you had a piece of science you wanted to share with the world, and you had the choice of either sending it to a typical science journal and having it go through the process of peer review and so forth, and then eventually being published some period of time later, or your alternative choice would be to print your paper out, load it into a rocket ship with a rover, send it to Mars, have the rocket ship land on the surface of Mars, and throw your paper out onto the surface of the planet and take pictures of it, and then beam those pictures back to Earth. That would take less time. And it would also be free, because things that NASA images are all free. And actually, even more remarkably, it would be cheaper. Okay? So it would actually cost less money to print every single paper published in the world, put it onto a rocket ship and send it to Mars, along with a dozen or so of these robots to take pictures of those papers and send them back to Earth. Think about the absurdity of that fact, that it actually costs less money to send these things to Mars than it does to actually put them through the standard process of peer review. And that's because, in addition to all of its other craziness, this system is incredibly expensive. We spend about $10 billion of money earmarked for science and scholarship on publishing every year. It's an absurd amount of money, and it bleeds us dry in a time when money is actually quite a problem. It also doesn't work very well, right? One of the main ideas of having a system like this is that we need to have journals to manage the communication of information and to make sure that what gets published is right and clean. But we know it doesn't do this. This is just one of my favorite examples of a paper that was completely wrong that still managed to be published in a high-profile journal. The system does things, but it doesn't work in the way that we often claim it works, to sort of keep the scientific literature pure. And finally, it distorts science in fundamental ways. That the pursuit of high-impact journals has become the defining feature of the way that people carry out science. And in fact, they conduct research, they write papers, and they choose what journals they publish in around the idea that what defines their careers is not the science they produce, but where where they publish it. And so this has an even bigger effect than just making it hard to get access to science. It actually changes the way that science is done. Okay, so the system is absurd. We're literally paying publishers $10 billion a year to oversee a process that doesn't work and which ends up locking most of the literature we produce behind paywalls. So the question, of course, is why does this happen and how do we fix it? So I'm going to give you a very brief history of kind of how I see the last 20 years of efforts to change publishing, just to highlight kind of what the challenge is and you know and how we can possibly fix it as a prelude to our conversation. So I got into this field as a scientist. I didn't go into science to be involved in publishing. In fact, I'd never thought about publishing as a enterprise until I was a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford. The lab I joined, the lab of Pat Brown, had invented this cool new technology, the DNA microarray. It's kind of lost to history, but its main contribution was that it allowed you to study the behavior of an entire organism's component of genes in one single experiment. And this organism here happens to be the yeast Saccharomyces cerevisiae that makes beer, so it's adored by many of us. But this shift in experimental methodology had a big impact on what kind of information we needed to have in our heads in order to understand and interpret our experiments. So at the time we started to do this work, there were something like 50,000 papers that had been published describing something about the behavior of one of these genes. So I had come from a PhD where I studied 2 genes for 7 years, and I was a little bit of a radical for studying 2 instead of just 1, right? And I had on my desk a stack of papers that were the entire published corpus of every paper that had ever been written about those 2 genes. I'd seen them, I'd maybe read some of them, but I at least knew what was in all of them. And there was just no way I was going to be able to do that with 50,000 papers. But fortunately, at precisely the same time we were beginning to do those experiments, or we thought fortunately, the scientific literature started to go online. This is kind of the announcement from the proceedings of the National Academy in the United States of their launching an online edition of their journal. And by 1998, most of the major publishers of science had put the issues of their journal online. And so being a computer programmer, I thought, wow, this is great. I have all this experimental data over here. I have information about my experiments over here. If I have those both in digital form in a computer, I'm sure I can figure out some way to connect the two without having to read 50,000 papers. Also, fortunately, because at the time most of the stuff on the internet was happening within a 10-mile radius of Stanford, it turned out that the major online publisher of scientific journals was the Stanford Library. And so we went down to the Stanford Library with a disk, another piece of archaic technology. We went down there with a disk and with the expectation that we would be able to just get all of the scientific literature that they had in their computers on a disk, take them back to our lab and do whatever it was we were going to do. But they not just said no, they kind of laughed at us and said, no, you scientists can't have the scientific literature that your colleagues produced because it's actually not owned by you. It's owned by journals, and the journals don't want you to have it. So this was really the first time I'd ever thought about any of the issues that we now think about in science publishing, about who owns the scientific literature, how it's produced, how it's funded, why it's done this way. But the second we ran into this problem, we started to think about this as a problem for all of science. Now, we had a very good example of how to fix it, or how to fix one part of it, which is how the physicists do things. So already before the modern internet was born, physicists were sharing all their papers online with each other, and they continue to do so. The physics community realized that they needed a fast and easy way to share papers with each other. They realized that the internet could do that, and so they just did it. This is an early view of what became archive.org. At the time, it was called xxx.lanl.gov, XXX being lexigraphically after www, but I think you can understand why they changed the name. So as the modern internet was born, XXX became a liability. But you know, from the early 90s, physicists had been sharing papers with each other online. We thought, well, this is great. Why don't we just do this in the rest of science and then layer on top of it peer review and all the other things we'd like to do with the literature? We'd have this idealized version of a publishing system. Pat Brown, my postdoctoral advisor, was thinking about these issues a lot. He went to the director of the National Institutes of Health in the US, Harold Varmus, and convinced him that this was a good and important idea. He immediately created or proposed a system for essentially doing the physics archive on steroids for all of biomedical science. And that would be a system that provided free and immediate access to all the published biomedical literature. It would have peer review carried out by the successor of what journals were at the time, basically peer review engines. Publishing would be done centrally by this large database, then peer review would happen, and it would let people just freely, quickly communicate all of their science at a far lower cost with no limitations and not lose any of the peer review and other things that people value. It would have replaced this crazy system we have today with 30,000 journals where papers go to one journal, then another. The money comes from subscriptions. It requires that people don't have access. It's nutty, with a much simpler system in which you have a centrally managed publishing utility that's funded by the government and other funders. Authors put their papers in when they want to share them. Other people can come and get them when they want to access them. They can download them and use them. Peer review happens on top of it. This is the Platonic ideal of scholarly communication. Unfortunately, and this is just kind of what it does. It would have placed control of publishing in the hands of authors, made immediate free access to everybody who wanted it. It would have streamlined peer review and made it more effective, and it would have recognized that funders are have a big interest in how their work is communicated. But unfortunately, it was not to be, because there were powerful forces in science who didn't want us to change the system. And the powerful forces in science were big commercial publishers, but also scientific societies in the United States who made a lot of money by selling journals back to universities, who have a lot of political power and killed this proposal. So I've spent the last 20 years trying to deal with the consequences of this missed opportunity, that biomedical science had a chance to do things the right way, and we chose not to go down that path. The things I've been doing, and I'm not going to dwell too much on them, is first, we convinced the NIH to at least do something. They created a system that would at least let people share their work freely, even if it didn't require that they do so. When publishers didn't, but it would have required the participation of publishers. When publishers didn't play ball, we organized an open letter and got scientists to say that they would only send their works to journals that participated. The journals called our bluff. Scientists didn't feel like they could respond because they needed journals to build their careers. And so we decided to get involved in publishing. We decided that we needed to give people an alternative way of publishing, hence the birth of Public Library of Science and its journals that Helen mentioned. The basic founding idea behind the PLOS was that we could use a different economic model for publishing, one in which you paid for the expenses of publishing were paid up front essentially by funders, allowing the work to be made freely available. It has, that idea has taken root to some extent. PLOS has become successful. PLOS One, a journal we published that doesn't have any doesn't make any choices about what's important. It just asks if the science is good. Was for a while the biggest journal in the world until other people copied it, and which is fine. That's what we wanted to see happen. This model, this idea of open access publishing, has grown. There are more and more open access journals. There are different takes on open access. People making things available by either preprints or what we call gold open access, which is where you pay the cost of publishing, or various other models, now represent something like a quarter of all the science that is published today. But if you had told me that it would, almost 20 years of fighting this game and actually creating things that were successful, and we'd still only be at 25%, I would probably not have started, because to me this is not a success. This is largely a failure. The idea we had that this new model was going to change the way, not just the economics of publishing, but fundamentally change the way scholarly communication works, has not proven to be true. So they haven't changed in the way we'd hoped. And I think it's because we made a mistake. Okay? And the big mistake we made was that we responded to the fact that the people who killed eBiomed were motivated by economics. They were big publishers who made a lot of money in publishing, and so we thought the problem was economics. That if we fixed the economics of publishing, that we would fix publishing. But it turns out that that wasn't actually the problem. Right, this is just saying what I said. They did it for economic reasons. But the problem with publishing isn't how we fund journals, and this is where I want to kind of leave us in a few minutes. The problem is that we have journals, right? So PLOS and other open access publishers created journals that were funded in a different way. But I've now come to realize that the problem with all of this is that we have journals in the first place, right? And we are addicted to journals, especially in the biomedical research community. We're addicted to high-profile titles like Science, Nature, and Cell, and we're addicted to the lower-tier versions of these, each of which kind of live in their own little hierarchy of journal after journal after journal. People live their careers trying to get their work into the highest impact journals. And so long as this is true, so long as people's careers are built on where they publish, not what they publish, it's going to be impossible to change the way that we structure how we communicate. So, right, this is just another way of saying it, that basically all the pathologies in publishing, I would actually argue that many of the pathologies in science itself stem from this addiction to journals. And it's the fact that we use journal title as the way we record the community's view about the value of a work of science, and more importantly, about the contributions of the scientists who carried it out, that is ultimately the plague that is killing us. Right, so it's the fact that we have these brands of journals, this is what's made it impossible to change publishing. Every time we create something new and better in publishing, and we try to convince the community to adopt it, they all say basically the same thing, which is, yeah, that's great, I love open access, but in order to get a job, promotion, a grant, I have to publish in high-impact journals. Universities embed this principle, in some cases explicitly, where your worth as a scientist is judged by the scores on journals that you publish your papers in. It is a central truth, probably the single greatest central organizing truth in biomedical research today, is that we judge things by where they're published, not what they contain. And scientists in general are reluctant to embrace new things in publishing if they don't simultaneously allow them to continue to do this. This allows, the economic problem we saw at the beginning, which is it allows publishers to engage in truly extortionist publishing practices, right? These are the profit margins of some major corporations in the world. And right, I think people think about Google as printing money, right? But literally, it's Springer and Elsevier who are the people who are printing money. You'd be better off investing your money in Elsevier than in Google, and that's crazy, right? So this is just another way. So it's been about the pursuit of science, the journal, not about science. So long as journals won't exist, things won't get better. But the beautiful irony is we don't actually need journals. They're a complete artifact of history, right? Journals exist because the printing press was invented before the internet. If things had gone the other way around, we never would have invented journals, right? There's a great saying that spreads around the internet that in the age of the internet, publishing is a button. It's not an industry. It's not a technology. It's literally just a button. And this is beginning. The seeds of this taking root in biology are beginning. We have finally a functioning preprint server in biomedical sciences, bioRxiv. It's growing exponentially. It still only has about 2% of the biomedical research literature in it, so it's by no means taken root. But we have an opportunity to use this template where biomedical scientists getting comfortable sharing their work on their own volition. But for all the reasons I said before, if the only thing we do is have a preprint server, we're not going to change anything because people still are going to feel the need to send their work to journals. Yeah, it's my matricization. It took me a long time to get the reflection of nature in the sunglasses there, so I want to make sure you see it. The reality is we don't actually need journals to do what we do, and where I hope we can go in the conversation is talking about what we can do instead of journals, right? The fundamental thing we need to do, and the fundamental legacy of the print world that we have failed to shed, is the idea that we have to associate peer review and publishing. Right now, those things go hand in hand with each other. You get your paper peer reviewed when you publish it, and only when you publish it. If we can break that association, to have people publish in one way and peer review in another way, then finally we can end the tyranny of journals across science. Now is the time. I'm careful to say that because I've said it like 20 times in the history of science publishing, but it does feel like something's different here. And the thing that's different here is that funders have finally started to get fed up with the publishing system. So this is, my funder, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, its president has written a piece about sort of fundamentally changing the way that science communication happens. You see a lot of things in Europe going on with Plan S and other things where funders are coming together and saying enough is enough. This system is too expensive and it doesn't really work to do what we want to accomplish. And so I don't think anybody has properly defined the right solution, and certainly no one's built one yet. But the moment is right because the people who really make the decisions ultimately in science, the people who fund our work, are starting to pay attention to this. It wasn't mentioned, but I've actually just started as the editor-in-chief of a journal called eLife. eLife was founded 7 years ago. It's an open access journal, but it's still a journal whose original purpose was to think about better ways of doing peer review. Under my guidance, I hope to lead eLife into being the sort of first example of a publisher who embraces this world of publishing and peer review as separate endeavors, and I'll be happy to take your questions on that. And that is it, and now we can chat. And thank you for signing. I'm on that side. When you say right and it's on stage, you never know it.
Well, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. And what we're doing, just to give you the context, so this is the unboxing events in Unboxing Open Scholarship here at Trinity. What we're doing, it's a year of debate and discussion because there are these mandates coming around from the funders of Plan S and so on. And those will be top-down, if you like. But also what we thought, the Dean of Research and myself and various other colleagues, is that we've bought ourselves a year to think this through, because everyone has to work out what does it mean and where do they individually stand. So it's bottom up and it's not necessarily all imposed. Now, one of the things I hear as we're having this conversation with colleagues is yeah. A lot of it is what does it mean for me? And so, for example, we're part of LERU, the League of European Research Universities, and it's a cross-cutting issue that's going to be discussed by the rectors of LERU in a month's time or so. Professor Leeson and I were at a meeting in Brussels there was a tweet that really summarized it for me that was presented, which was a researcher saying that I've been thinking about this for a year and I am going open access. And then said, collaborators and publishers beware. So they had made the individual choice. Now, you have championed, and your lab has always been open access. And I'm sure a lot of colleagues in the room are thinking, well, what does that mean for me? Because on the LERU, there's the roadmap to open scholarship, there's all these pillars, there's all these practical things, but it comes down to culture change, and the culture change around reward and recognition and so on. So how has it affected both you and your career? And then what about everyone else who's worked in your lab? Presumably they're self-selecting and they want to work in an open access lab, but how has it affected their careers?
Yeah, so just to give you a little just background. So I started my lab at Berkeley in 2000, and this was just at the same time all of this open access stuff was starting. And so I both wanted to live up to these principles, but also felt like I couldn't, on the one hand, be arguing that everybody should be changing the way that they publish and then not doing it myself. And I got lots of advice from senior colleagues who told me that this would be career suicide, that in a field and in an institution that judged its candidates by where they publish, choosing to shun this was considered to be an ill-advised thing to do. And in fact, most people said, maybe you'll survive, but your trainees won't. And so that didn't dissuade me, but it made me realize that if I were going to do this, I had to be very public about it. That I couldn't just do it and hope that people noticed on my CV that we were not publishing in the big journals. So I made a very deliberate decision to be very public about what we were doing in the lab, and partly that was a marketing reason. I wanted to show people that we were, I was living up to my own words. And what I didn't realize at the time, and which ended up actually working, I think, out well for me and my trainees, was that it had an effect on the way that people looked at my lab's output and the people that we were training, in that instead of just scanning someone's CV and looking for big name papers, which they might have done with me and my trainees, and then looked at their papers and said, 2 PLOS papers, they couldn't get their papers in Nature. Because we attached in my letters of recommendation on our lab's website and other places, we said, we shun those journals. It forced everybody to look at our output in a different way. And I know that this worked, not just because I and the people from my lab were successful, but because I work at a public university. When I went up for tenure, I got to see all of the things people wrote about me. It's sort of part of our sunshine ordinance that we can see all these letters. And many of the letters said exactly this. They said, yes, he doesn't have papers in these top journals, but it's because he and his lab have chosen not to do so. And so it's worked for me. I was in a pretty good position to start doing this. I mean, I was already reasonably well known in the field by that time. I was at a big university. It probably wouldn't have worked for everybody, but I do think there's at least some lesson to be learned, that the challenge is not just to do these things, but to explain why you do them and force people to evaluate you in a different way. And actually, going back to the point you started with about the bottom-up versus top-down, I think the other thing I've realized in talking to other people about why they don't do things like this is that they feel they want to, at least they tell me they want to, that a lot of people want to publish more openly. They don't like having their papers behind paywalls, but they don't feel like they live in a system that allows them to do that. So I think the ultimate lesson is that we need both bottom-up actions from people deciding this is important and being willing to make changes in the way that they function as scientists to change the world. But we also need universities and funders and the other people who kind of control your access to jobs, or your advancement in careers and funding, to make corresponding changes in the way that people are evaluated, so that the people who are making the right choices on the grassroots level are at least not punished and ideally rewarded for doing so.
So University College London has already sort of moved in that direction, and it's quite a sort of poster child, if you like, for open scholarship. One of the things that when we collated Trinity's response to Plan S, there was a lot of anxiety expressed around quality. And just before I came here, I was talking to an academic colleague who was telling the tale that he'd been asked to give 5 of his papers and rank them. And he put one, his first or second one was in PLOS 1, and then his 5th one was in Nature. And he was challenged on this. What do you mean? You know, he simply said, my one in PLOS 1 was better than my one in Nature. But I know, again, if I can reflect, there are questions about quality in open access publications, or whatever we call them. Would you sort of reflect on that?
So it's a complicated world to know what quality in science means. I think our goal in PLOS 1 was to focus on the things in quality that are relatively easy to judge. That is it an actual good work of science? That is it well done? Are the controls explicated and so forth? And not to try to make judgments about whether it's important. And our current system equates importance and quality in ways that I think are counterproductive. The most exciting topics and work that has the most tantalizing results are often not the best, most well done experiments. So one problem we have is we confuse attention and import with quality in science to our destruction, I think. But I think more fundamentally, I think we have to ask ourselves, A, what do we mean by quality? How do we want to judge it? And is a system in which we take papers and only make a judgment about their quality and import at one fixed point in time by 2 or 3 people, judging it in the context of should I or shouldn't I publish this in the journal, the best way to tell if a work is quality or not. I think I, like all scientists, care deeply about finding quality works of science. And I think there's been a misimpression in the community that because open access has focused also on making sure that every scientist has the ability to communicate their work to their colleagues, that we're not interested in quality. To us, these are 2 independent phenomena. There's a need to let everybody communicate their work and to do so in a free and open manner so that all science is accessible to all people. And then there's simultaneously a need to figure out how to organize all of that published material so that we can recognize what's important, not just what's important when we look at it today, but what is important when we look at it years down the road. We've done an okay job with the first part of that, trying to get science out to the world. What we haven't done is to create a good and viable system for judging science that is outside the context of publishing. That is, and that's really what we want to try to do next, is to simultaneously empower people to share their work freely without barriers, but then to build up an infrastructure that allows scientists to judge the quality of work, the import of work, the audience of work, in much the way that journals are supposed to do that today, but to do it independently. And sort of a fundamental guiding principle for me is that system will be better. That by freeing up the system of assessment of quality and import and audience from the act of publishing, it actually lets us do that job better than we currently do it. Right now, assessment is very, very limited. It's small numbers of people, one fixed point in time, and it's not even asking, Nature doesn't just ask you, is this paper a quality paper? It also asks you, is it an important paper? Is it a paper that'll bring in an audience? And those things often conflict with each other. And I think that if we really are interested in quality, the first thing we should want to do is to get rid of journals, because they're an obstacle to the optimal assessment of quality, not, as I think most people think, the ultimate protector of quality in science.
Thanks. So you mentioned the Platonic utopian before,
Yep.
which made me think. So Plato.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a scientist. So.
No, he talks about poets being the unacknowledged legislators of the world. So I'm wondering, with your run for Congress, whether you're then thinking, what was behind that run for, to run in politics? Was that because you think scientists, particularly around climate change or whatever, are the unacknowledged legislators of the world and that should get more stuck in?
Yeah, so I know this is going to sound like a different thing, but in fact, my push for changes in publishing actually brought me into touch a lot with politicians. And one of the things I realized, initially in a very narrow and personal way, but ultimately in a bigger sense, was just how little not just scientific background and expertise, but scientific perspective there is in politics. And there were even in my opinion, the most ardent supporters of science and science funding in the U.S. Congress, and I'm sure it's true everywhere, were didn't know science. They didn't think like scientists. They didn't think empirically. They were a different intellectual tradition, if you want to give them that much credit. And so
the majority are from law, actually.
Right. So in the U.S., it's law and business, right? And so I had long felt like we would benefit in public world from having more people with science backgrounds. And I'd often noticed that, for scientists, for people in the scientific community, when we have students or people in their mid-careers who say they want to go into careers in science, this is viewed as leaving science. It's something you do if you're abandoning science, not as a way of continuing science. And of course, our election in 2016 made some of these things more acute. And but in particular, I was actually, what motivated me immediately was that I was watching how members of the U.S. Senate, on both sides of both political parties, were questioning people who were being appointed to jobs that had something to do with science, in the environment and science funding and health and other things. And it was striking how bad the questions were. So not only did they not understand the issues, they didn't understand how to talk about them. And so I just had this vision that, well, if we just had a few scientists in the US Senate and in Congress, that we could start to ask the right questions and so forth. And so I didn't really ever think I was going to win this election. So, but if anything, 2016 taught us is that don't make predictions about who's going to win. And so I thought I had kind of a clever way of explaining what we were doing, that I was trying to bring reality back into science. And honestly, I did it, and to be honest, it was literally just a joke. I was on Twitter and I was bored, and I'm like, oh, let's run for Senate. And but enough people got interested in it that I started to take it seriously. And the way the election unfolded made it impossible to do. And of course, I couldn't raise enough money to become a real candidate. But I do think that something happened. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was just the environment, that a lot more scientists started running for office in our last elections in 2018. And although very few of them won seats in Congress, a lot of them won seats in our state legislatures, and that's how you really get into Congress. It's not by just declaring on Twitter that you're going to run for Senate. You run in the state legislatures and you win. And I think that there is at least the seeds of a movement, and I think a broader realization in at least some parts of the U.S. that we need people in political power who think like scientists. Not that they're going to just take money and hand it out to scientific causes, but who approach everything, not just science issues, who approach everything in the kind of empirical way that scientists think about the world. And so, I do think it's kind of a, metaphor, not necessarily a good one, right? About that's the way we look at science publishing. I think if we can't fix that, right? If scientists can't fix something that is partly a practical problem, but mostly a sociological problem in our own ranks, in ways that actually benefit the public and make our work better. If we can't fix that, then how do we ever imagine fixing something like climate change? So, not to lay the guilt on people, but this is, you have to fix science publishing, because that will let the rest of the world know we can fix climate change.
I'm personally a huge supporter of, do you know The Conversation?
Yeah.
So there's one in the state. I should declare an interest that a very close friend of mine is the editor of the States, and there's one in the UK I think we use here, and then there's one in Australia. And I like the strapline of that, which is academic rigor, journalistic flair.
Yeah.
And that's again another aspect of getting science, academic knowledge into the widest world.
Yeah, I was just looking at the Book of the Kells, right? Mm-hmm. Of course, because I'm in Dublin, and because my kids would kill me if I didn't. But it's amazing to look at, right? It's a religious document. It's the written in Latin. Its prose is not particularly, it's not high prose, I think. But it communicates things, right? Its language is straightforward. It's the illustrations that they use in the Book of Kells, right? I think. Anyway, as I was looking at it, I was thinking, because I was thinking about my talk, about how the recent history of science publishing has driven people to write unreadable drivel, for the most part. That nobody writes science papers to be read, right? We don't write them to communicate. People write them to get published. Yes, sometimes they're readable because people can write better than others, but the main purpose of writing a science paper in science is to get it published. And if you're forced to make a choice between things that make it more likely to get published and things that make it better at communicating, I see it all the time. People get punished for having flair. If you try to draw cute pictures in your paper, it's viewed as being unscientific. Because we think about published papers as somehow a community collectively assessed document, they have the style of Soviet 5-year plans, right? There's no individuality, there's no anything. It was striking to me that if you look at the first edition of the Proceedings of the Royal Society, that's much more fun to read. It's more readable, even though they use weird letters and don't spell things right. I have an easier time accessing the science that they were doing in the 17th century than I do accessing science written by my colleagues who were doing something similar to me in the 21st century. And it's not because people aren't fundamentally less skilled as communicators. It's that the form and the function and the way we do things is antithetical to communication. So I like this tagline, right? We should have scientific rigor. It should say scientific rigor and scientific flair. We should have flair in the way we communicate. And even go back 50 years in the early 20th century, papers were written to communicate. People wrote papers to tell a story, to try to tell something to their colleagues. They're written in plain and accessible English. I can pick up a paper from fields I don't even understand very well from the early 20th century and understand their work better than I can from my own field in the 21st century. And that should just be damning a view to everybody here.
Well, to your point, actually, I actually did my dissertation on Swift's use of science for satire. And what he did is he took the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society and these experiments, and then in book 3 of Gulliver's Travels, just slightly exaggerated them. Yeah. So there's a wonderful experiment which was to capture sunbeams on Hampstead Heath, hermetically seal them and take them into the depth of the city. And that is in the philosophical translations of the Royal Society. Book 3 of Gulliver's Travels. It's there, only exaggerated.
It's also in Science last week.
Oh.
Just kidding.
Anyway, on that note, it's 1 o'clock. Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm going to open it out now to anyone. I do have the light straight in my eye, so, that's great. So, and we've got a roving Mike, James, and another one over there. So, over to James behind you, please, the gentleman there. Thank you.
Hi, Mike. I like the socks.
Oh, yeah.
One problem that we have in science is how to filter or find either fraudulent papers or papers that are simply wrong or bad. Papers that are published, say, by people with a huge commercial conflict of interest, or the Wakefield vaccine paper, which is retracted later. And the current system is really clumsy. It takes a long time, but it can kind of cope with this. So if you really open things up, as to a key part is the reviewing and the later reviewing. If you really open it up, we'll need protection or mechanisms.
Right. Well, look, anybody can say anything they want on the internet, right? So the problem isn't that people can publish things. So let's take the Wakefield paper as a good example. If you talk to people about the Wakefield paper, anti-vaccine people, of whom we have far too many in California, their big thing is that they say constantly, that was in a peer-reviewed journal, right? That the problem with that paper was that we gave it a false veneer of authenticity. We as scientists say something that we know to be false to the public. We say that if a paper is in a peer-reviewed journal, we essentially say to them, if a paper is in a peer-reviewed journal, it's right. So in a lot of times that scientists communicate with politicians or with the public, they make a direct correlation between peer-reviewed and correct, something we know to be false. We know that to be false in part because the system has failings, as the Wakefield paper points out, but we also know there are fundamental reasons why that's not true, which is that something that we thought was right one year, we learn later it was wrong, because that's the way that science progresses. So I think the problem isn't opening up the world to people being able to communicate. It's in being very clear with the world, what it means. In bioRxiv, right, if you post a paper in bioRxiv, nobody assumes it's correct. What we assume it is that the author has put their name on it, and whatever that entails, but it comes with no guarantee of validity or anything. I won't mince words, we lie to the public and ourselves in saying that peer review solves that problem, right? What peer review is it's 2 or 3 people making their best judgment, sometimes making their best judgment. Sometimes they're not the right people. Sometimes they're on an airplane and have 80% oxygen and not really making their best judgments. It's an imperfect system. And the problem with the Wakefield thing today is, even though it's retracted, right, it still bears the imprimatur of the Lancet, right? And so in an ideal world, we would be constantly revisiting the assessment that we make of papers, and getting away from this idea that, and again, it's a relic of the fact that we associate publishing and peer review. Getting away from the idea that we only assess something once, and away from the idea that our assessments are infallible, right? We should be comfortable with revisiting papers, and if we make it so that the journal in which a work was published is not the sole thing that matters about it, now it opens up the door to coming back and saying, yeah, we thought this paper was right in 1920, but by 1930, we knew it was wrong. And the same thing's true with lots of science. That, again, that's not to say that it's guaranteed that it'll work that way. We could screw it up, just like, like you look at social networks and things. They had lofty ideals about connecting people and so forth, but then, they end up being, places where Nazis can harass anybody, right? That it's not an easy problem. It's not an automatic It's not an automatic outcome of changing the way we communicate. But at least we know that the current system doesn't work. And it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. And I think this is a really critical point, that we need to not just tell the public, but tell ourselves that the system we use right now to decide on the impact and validity of works just doesn't work, and that we need to do better. I think we can do better, but we have to break free of the mental baggage of thinking that this is the best way to do things, a kind of lie we tell ourselves all the time, and only then will we be able to fix it.
Please.
So yeah, just coming from the biology perspective, I was thinking, I mean, apart from the economics, there are a lot of things, cultural things, that are mirrored in the open access journal world, you know, compared to the more traditional journals. And I'm just thinking, I think some of those things aren't necessarily bad things. So for example, if I'm coming at biology and I want to try and find out, well, what are the trends in biology at the moment? How do I decide what papers to read? Because there's thousands of papers out there. I might go to one of the more high impact biology journals. And then if I'm in a very specific area, I might read something in a more specialist journal. And similarly on the open access side, I probably wouldn't go to PLOS 1 to find out what's happening in biology trends. I'd go to PLOS Biology. Yeah. And I think that's quite an important process for a reader, that there is still that triaging that's happened. I'm just wondering your views on that, because I'm wondering, are you saying that you think there's things about the open access world has to radically change, where you almost get rid of journals altogether, or if there's still that role for that kind of hierarchy?
I think we should get rid of journals completely. That, you know, I mean, it's an irony in some ways that I've always felt this way, that journals were the problem, but we sort of went about it by starting journals, right? Like so yes, there's a role played by the hierarchy of journals in our world today, which is it sort of sorts things by level of interest, right? If it does anything well, it's that. It like identifies papers of broad interest and you maybe overemphasizes the extent of interest. So I don't think we have to do that by mapping every paper to one particular journal, right? The way we tend to do it right now is if it's a very broad interest paper, it goes into eLife or PLOS Biology. If it's a very narrow interest paper, it goes into PLOS 1, and it's assumed that you know, only the people in the field relevant to the paper are going to be interested in it, and since they can search for stuff they're interested in, they don't need a classification, right? But there's no particular reason why that organization has to be done by putting things into buckets, or that it only has to be done once. So one view of the future, a vision for the future, is we don't have any journals. People publish their work on some open central place. You know, don't think of it as a preprint server, because pre-print is the wrong. These things are not pre-anything, and they're not printed. So this is the public library of science that we always had in mind, a place where people just go and publish their work, and it's freely available. And then the editorial, the descendant of the editorial board of PLOS Biology comes along and says, our job is to find the most interesting papers in biology. Again, it's subject to whatever our biases are and our levels of interest, but we're going to define a set of papers that are the most interesting papers in biology, and we're going to use some editorial process to pick them out and whatever, some system, and we're going to attach our name or attach some classification to papers, whatever it is. They can do that. It would serve exactly the same function that it serves today, which is you like PLOS Biology's editorial standards, so you go and find the papers they choose. But it would be better in two fundamental ways. First of all, they would now be able to choose from amongst all of science, not just the papers that were submitted to them. So now it actually isn't restricted by the one-to-one mapping that you have in the journal world. I think that's critical. And two, the papers, and it's related, the papers that PLOS Biology assessed would also be assessed by somebody else, and maybe they would have a very different opinion. And so you can take advantage of the multiplicity of people looking at the literature and the multiplicity of views to come up, I think, with a much better, much more robust and effective curation of the scientific literature than we have in journals today.
Thank you. James, just behind you.
Go ahead. The woman saying next to you. Go ahead, let her go.
Hi, just to get back to the point about the peer review, and I totally agree. I mean, do you need it at all? I mean, could scientists not just vouch for their own papers? You've got a range of scientists on a paper, you know, first author down to the senior, and you know, maybe have some sort of regulatory body that would check every now and then, and if there's some problem with it, well then the reputations go down. I mean, peer review is essentially flawed, as you pointed out yourselves, but you still keep talking about it.
Yeah, so I think that every time a scientist reads a paper, it's valuable for them to share their opinion. That's sort of what I mean by peer review, is that lots of people read papers. Maybe you think it's valuable to have every paper read by somebody. That is, I fundamentally believe that when scientists read papers, they generate useful information for other scientists to take advantage of. So you can think about peer review as just an organized way of ensuring that happens and of sharing the results. I think that what we do is we store that information poorly right now because we only encode it in a journal title. It has all these other problems. But I do believe that you want, that's what science is. It's a collective enterprise. We want people reading other people's work and not just using it and embedding it in their own work, but in sharing their thoughts about it. On the other hand, though, I think you're right, which is that right now we don't ask scientists to stand behind their work really in the right way, right? What we ask is that they get their work published in the right journals, and that in somehow is supposed to speak to their quality. You're not rewarded in any meaningful way for publishing enduring work or work that is is used for perpetuity. Instead, you're judged in 2020 by where your work was published in 1996, right? And so I think the best way to I don't believe a government body can sort of regulate scientists effectively in that way, because then you're just saying peer review in another term. But I think that if you have a system in which works are judged continuously for as long as they're used, works are judged both positively and negatively, and that those judgments matter, right? It doesn't matter what people said at day one. If you're being evaluated in 2020, you should be evaluated based on how your work is thought of today. If that were true, then it would actually reward scientists for being for publishing durable work, for caring about the validity of their science, rather than the system today, which rewards them for getting into high-profile journals, even if those papers are wrong. In fact, the craziest thing about the world today is that there are a lot of scientists who serially publish something in a high-profile journal, and then 3 years later they publish the paper saying that their first paper was wrong in the same high-profile journal. So actually there's a double benefit, right? You don't only get one paper, you get two papers. And it's crazy that that's the way it works.
Okay, there's another. Yep, that's great, thank you.
Thank you very much. There's so much to applaud in everything you said, including about how we need to be able to change how we do science in order to have any relevance outside of science. But on the issue of the problem, I'd like to challenge you on the assertion that the core problem is our addiction to journals, because as you pointed out, the journals haven't really changed. What's changed is our addiction to them, the level of fraud in these journals, and their growing capacity to distort the science. And it seems that what's changed is everything around the journals, and we're all under increasing pressure to do more and more with less and less. And in an ideal world where we get rid of all the journals and we only publish in places like eLife or preprint servers, which I think would be a very good degree of progress, we would still have the situation where we don't have enough resources for all of us to perform at the level that we are all expected to perform at. And I can't see any solution to this other than give research grants by lottery systems or start to restrict how many PhD students we recruit. But I'm just wondering, in terms of the broader scientific community, what do you see as the solution to these challenges?
Yeah, so it's true that, of course, if you have there always has been and there always will be competition for resources within science, and so when you don't when you have anything that involves competition for resources, it's going to bring out bad behaviors in people. So I don't think we fundamentally fix that. Of course, I'd love for there to be more money in science, for it to be allocated more fairly. I think we could have a long conversation about why I think that's gone in the wrong direction too. So yeah, like you don't magically, this is why I said, you don't magically create utopia by getting rid of journals. So in some ways, our addiction to journals is a symptom of broader trends in science as well. In my life, I've seen journal title get more and more important in people's careers, and it's a complicated mix of competition for resources, but also of changing ways in which people are evaluated and a more bureaucratic system for evaluation. That goes hand in hand with other things. So, however, I do think you can, cocaine was around before people became addicted to it. So, who's responsible, the people or the drug? I don't know. But the drug is a problem, right? So the fact that we have made journals such a central place in the architecture of science means that they have become part of the problem. There was a book I read 15 years ago or so by Larry Lessig called Code, and its whole argument was that the choices people make in architecting the internet, rules about how you share things, rules about who can do what, rules about how it's governed, fundamentally alter the way in which it manifests as a social phenomenon. And I feel very much the same way about science, that journals and peer review are the code of science. They're architected incredibly poorly. And we've ignored that. We've let the problem get worse and worse. And we've never had a serious effort in science to actually fix the code, the way that they're used. And that's when I said I think we made a mistake about challenging economics versus journals. It's that not recognizing that it's the coding of behaviors in science through journals and journal titles and the structure of journals that is problematic. We could replace it with a worse code, right? I mean, I don't think it would be better to just say, well, we're going to judge everybody based on internet comments on their papers. I think we know that doesn't work well. So we could go in the wrong direction, but I do think we're smart people. We solve problems. We solve big problems. We can sequence genomes. We can send rockets to the moon and rockets stuffed with 10 million papers. And so I just believe we can address many of these broader problems, including the way people advance in their careers and their just general feeling that the system is fair, right? Yes, people complain about not having resources, but also they feel like they're being judged in incredibly unfair ways and unbiased ways. They're not rewarded for being productive and creative in the right way. So does it solve all the world's problems? No. Does it make science as it exists better? I think yes.
Just right by you.
Competition for microphones.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to challenge you in relation to the structure of a journal paper, and that's something problematic. I actually think it's a remarkable way of structuring information, and perhaps the fact that it hasn't changed is because it's a good one. In 10 to 12 pages, or depending on your field, you get an introduction, you get methods, you get a sense of what's going on, and it's not clear to me that that's a poor system per se, whatever about open access and so on.
Yeah. Okay. So if you weren't submitting your paper to a journal, right? If you were an isolated scientist and it's your job to create a digital representation of your work, I would argue that you would not write a paper in the way that it is currently written. So, for example, methods. I mean, yes, you can sometimes reconstruct methods, but in my lab, we write protocols in an entirely different way when we're using them in the lab than we write them in a paper. We use videos. We have images. Just the nature of how you explain an experiment is it ineffective? No. Is it anywhere close to how well we could do in a world where we didn't try to mimic the form of a printed article? Yes. And the same thing's true for how we represent data and figures, right? So simple, stupid things, right? Like in many different applications, I can load my data into the application and play with it. I can't do that in a scientific figure. So it's not that there's nothing valuable about the format. It's that the format is not evolved. It has not embraced technology to make it more effective at what it does. And I think the language itself, the writing style is not, it's not really meant to be read. It's in the classical sense. And some papers are, some papers aren't. So it's hard to put a broad brush. But all the reality that we know, people don't read that many papers front to back. Right? They get snippets of information out of them. They're interested in methods. They're interested in data. So the form is not matched to the way that people use and access them. I don't know what the right ultimate evolution is, but I do think that just constraining people to produce something that would be printed and put on a piece of paper it's limiting at the very least, if not fundamentally wrong. Some papers would be better as videos, right? They'd be better with you sat in the lab and showed someone something. Why can't I do that? Why can't I make a video of my paper and share the data and get credit for that? You can't right now because we demand that it be a journal paper.
Thank you. I think there was one over here. Did I
We'll ask
see
a question anyway.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I wanted to confirm that I have the same idea as you. So when it comes to branding of the journals, such as Nature and other things, I totally agree with that. But I wanted to point to two other important issues in my opinion and ask for your opinion as well. So I think conflict of interest is very important, and I think that's why Frontiers is not doing well, because financially it is part of the Springer, I suppose. So that's why I have problem with that. So again, there is something in many open access journals such as PLOS One and Frontiers that there is no need for novelty or significance. So, okay, so I agree that there are some benefits in that, but I think in my opinion, that's why that PLOS One is going toward a failure. That's my personal opinion. But at the same time, so as a journal such as PLOS Computational Biology or PLOS Biology, they are going in the right way. They are from the same organization. And what's the difference here, in my opinion, because there is a specific editorial board, trusted, high profile, not based on the fame, but based on the expertise and quality that somehow guards the quality of that. And I think that's the benefit of the journals. It's actually the manifestation of a small community of reliable academics that guard the quality of the science. So if we have no names, it just reminds me of a communist society that everyone is the same, so that's the claim, but in fact they are not.
I hope I was, that is not, I do not want a world in which there is not assessment, right? So look, there's a longer conversation to be had about PLOS One, but there's, just to emphasize one thing, lots of people do science who spend years of their work producing data that at the time they cannot see the significance of and cannot convince someone that it's valuable. But every time someone spent their time doing science, so long as they've done experiments that are reproducible and have the right controls, they should be able to publish it because, first of all, that's important that they be able to share their work. And second, because you never know how different pieces of information are going to be useful. So there's a principle behind what PLOS One's doing, which is not related to the assessing the novelty and interest of the audience. And PLOS One may or may not succeed as a business, but its model is now been copied in lots of places. So I think as an enterprise, it's been successful in what it was supposed to do. However, I agree completely that we want to have people organize themselves in a field around the idea of selecting work that they think is of quality. And by definition, those would be brands, whatever they want to call themselves. They might be the Genetic Society of America is going to decide on interesting papers in genetics. We're not going to stop evaluating science. We're not going to stop having people looking for quality and interest. What we are going to do, I hope, is stop giving individual groups the power to decide what should and shouldn't be shared, and to be exclusive have exclusive power to judge individual works of science. So it's keeping the thing you like, which is a smart editorial board of people you trust picking out papers, but getting rid of the bad side of that, which is that they control who gets published, and that they are the only ones who get to judge those papers, and they only do it at one fixed point in time. So I hope in this world I want to see instantiated, you keep all the good things and you lose all the bad things. It seems, why don't we do it?
Thank you.
Can I comment on PLOS One? I've had a paper rejected from PLOS One.
Yeah.
So that's all.
Is that a statement about PLOS One or about you?
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a long story about the nature of what it means for when we should and shouldn't reject a paper, right? But I think the thing is to move to a world in which we don't reject a paper, but which you say, this paper is garbage, right? Like, it's okay for someone to come along and judge a paper negatively, but it shouldn't be it shouldn't necessarily be a barrier to you sharing your work. It accomplishes the same thing to say anybody can share their papers. It means nothing for someone to have published the work other than that they chose to share it, and that somebody else, as comes along and says whether or not they think it's valid or important or interesting or whatever.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. I appreciate that what you've focused on primarily is within the biological sciences.
Yeah.
The discussion within Trinity in this year has broadened that out also to other areas, to scholarship in the humanities, for example. Yeah. And one of the concerns that's been expressed there, there's some confusion about what the economic model is and whether essentially the new world of publishing that you've been describing might have a consequence that the only people who get to publish are those who have the funding, who have the money to pay. And I wondered if you could talk a little about that. So
I think I'll just say where I think the ultimate solution is, and explain why it isn't the way it's gone so far. Which, first of all, I think if you look broadly at the economics of scholarly publishing, the money is coming from funders and universities, right? Whether they're paying it by giving money to a library who subscribes to journals and buys books and whatever, or they're giving it to authors to give money to journals up front, the money is coming from the people who sponsor research. So the right way to do publishing is for them to just fund it, to go back to conceptually, but not literally, back to a model where the academic universe just funds publishing without asking anybody to pay. So you shouldn't have to pay as a reader of scholarship, and you shouldn't have to pay as a producer of scholarship. That is, it makes much, much, much more sense to think about publishing as a utility. The costs are covered by science funders and humanities funders and whatever. I'm sure you need to think about you have to have a formula, and it has to scale in some way, and it has to go to people in a way that's they're competing for resources, and you have to have a market, but that fundamentally just recognize that the money is coming from the universities. When they sponsor, an art historian's research, they should also be sponsoring the art historian's ability to publish their research. They're already doing that because they're giving money to libraries and then they're buying books. They're just doing it in a convoluted, inefficient way. So the ultimate answer is publishing should just be a publicly funded utility for scholarship to take advantage of, avoiding the problems you have of people needing to have a lot of money to publish. So, the way, PLOS started a model, or was part of starting a model that doesn't do it that way, right? We used a model in which we charge a service to publish papers, and that model is also exclusionary because it means you can only if you have to have resources to publish, then now you're biasing not just to people in wealthy fields, but you're biasing to people who have lots of money within the wealthy fields. If that becomes the fundamental way that publishing works, then we've traded one form of bad access for another. We did it that way because we needed resources, and we felt it was a better model, a more direct way for funders to sponsor research than to pay for subscriptions, but we couldn't just get them to do it out front. We tried, but the funders wouldn't just sponsor what we were doing directly. So we created this model as the only economic alternative at the time to kind of accessing funder resources to support publishing, but not requiring the denial of access. But I do not think that's where we want to try to end up. I think we want to end up with funders directly sponsoring publishing. And I think, interestingly, there's now, like, we're heading in that direction, although imperfectly. Things like Plan S, whose implementation I have lots of problems with, but the broad concept that it's funders saying, it's important to us that our researchers communicate their work openly, and we're going to pay for it. That's the most important principle that's behind Plan S is that, and I think you're seeing that with the Wellcome Trust is doing things like that in the UK. Howard Hughes Medical Institute and Gates Foundation and other private funders in the US are thinking that way. Our NIH and NSF and big government funders in the US aren't doing that yet, but I think the funders have started to realize that neither of these models is really the clean way to do it, and that some version of a publicly sponsored publishing universe is the right way to go. So I think it's a big problem. Currently, there isn't a good, viable working example of that, and so I think we're always going to be fighting against this concern, especially from the humanities, where money just isn't available to publish in this manner. And I think the right answer is to not have transactions involved in scholarly communication at all, either as an author or as a reader, and to make it so that the information flows easily.
So we can continue this over lunch. I would very much like to thank our colleagues on AV and those who have had the microphones. I'd like to thank the colleagues who have been organising all the open boxing events, so Shane Collins, Lorraine Leeson, Arlene Healy, and Siobhan Dunn. And I would particularly like us to thank our speaker, Mike Houston. Thank you. Oh! It looks as if we've got one final question.
The question can stay, but I just wanted to say a couple of things. One is that Mike, there's Arnus Petrauskas is taking some students out for tea at 2, and students who want to talk to Mike can go along with him then. There's also going to be a beer session at 4:30 in Kennedy's, and especially young faculty, but others who are interested in talking can see him. And I also wanted to say that part of this was funded by the Wellcome Institutional ISSF program, and had a specific note from the Wellcome Trust as well that we should be supporting the initiatives that Helen and the library and college have been talking about, open scholarship. So both for the multiple directions towards this same common goal.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. That's great.
Thank you all for coming.